The health of Australia's Indigenous people is a major concern for all Australians. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have the worst health of all Australians and are one of the most disadvantaged groups in the community. At a meeting of Australian health ministers last year, each state and territory committed themselves to sign agreements aimed at improving the health of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. These agreements will seek to improve the health of Indigenous people through the better allocation of services, improved access to health services and better cooperation with all levels of government. The first agreement was signed recently in Adelaide by representatives from the federal and state governments, ATSIC, and the Aboriginal Health Council of South Australia, representing Aboriginal Medical Services. Afterwards, I spoke to the Federal Minister for Health and Family Services, Dr. Michael Wooldridge, about what the new arrangements mean.
It means, for the first time, the Commonwealth Government, the State Government, ATSIC and the Aboriginal Health Council, the AMSs, are all going to be working in the same direction. We're not going to be pulling in different directions. We're going to sit down around a table, thrash out our problems, and we're going to sign a bit of paper to commit all of us to do that.
How do you think it's going to improve Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health?
By itself, it might not do a lot, but this is an essential building block. We should have done this 20 years ago. What it's going to do is commit us all to working in the same direction rather than working in different directions. And what it's also going to do is put a bigger focus on mainstream services. The majority of Aboriginal people get their health through mainstream services, and they should be more culturally sensitive, and they should be aware of the needs of Aboriginal people. That's not to put down AMSs at all. They've got a very important role to play, but it'll help both. It'll give AMSs a seat at the table, and hopefully it'll do something with mainstream services to make them more aware of the needs of Aboriginal people.
This is the first agreement between a state and Commonwealth. When do you think the other state and territories will follow?
Well, our officials have been talking. Most of the other states and territories are enthusiastic, and there's a good chance within a couple of months we will have these agreements signed everywhere in Australia. This is the first, though, and that's a credit to Mike Armitage in South Australia, who were very enthusiastic early on.
Minister, how are you going to make sure that these principles are actually put in place?
Well, I'd say two things about that. The first is there's going to be a forum in each state that will be looking at how well all of us are doing in this, and that will keep the oversight. But the second thing I'd say is this isn't going to work without a bit of goodwill. The previous government, the way they tried to do things was bring out a big stick, whether it was in health, whether it was in Aboriginal affairs. Now that didn't seem to work. They weren't able to force the states with a big stick to do what they wanted. I'm trying a different approach. I'm trying to use a bit of goodwill and to see if we can get somewhere with that. I think that goodwill is there at the moment between myself, between Mike Armitage, between ATSIC and the Aboriginal Health Services, and I hope that can translate into something that's worthwhile for Aboriginal people.
Minister, what would you say to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people about these changes?
What I'd say is these changes give a legitimate voice to Aboriginal people and their organisations in the planning process. In themselves, they're not going to change the world, but they're an essential building block in trying to get things right. It's a building block that should have been in place ages ago. If we're going to make big improvements, it's going to be a long, hard slog. At least these changes today hopefully mean we're all pulling in the same direction, and over time I hope they'll show real benefits for Aboriginal people.
I also spoke with Peter Miller, the chairperson of the Aboriginal Health Council of South Australia, and asked him how the new agreement will help Indigenous health.
The aims of this, it's improving access to both mainstream and Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Pacific health and health-related programs and Pacific health services throughout the country. In that I mean you've got in South Australia you've got Ceduna Kuniba Health Service based at Ceduna, you've got Yalata Maralinga based in Yalata, you've got Port Lincoln Health Service, Aboriginal Health Service, Pika down at Port Augusta. It reflects on the mainstream, and the mainstream that I'm talking about is the hospitals that are based in the city, like the Royal Adelaide, the Queen Elizabeth. They are the mainstream services that I'm sort of looking at, that we've tapped into over the years, and the continuation of those services should be working a lot better with the agreement that is about to be signed.
If you would like to find out any more information about how the new agreement will affect you or your community, you can speak to the State Coordinator on these numbers.